Welcome to the 2025 Giller Book Club. I'm Jacob Alvarado, and I'll be your host for tonight. A couple quick reminders before we get things started. First off, please make sure to have your Zoom on a side-by-side view for the best possible viewing experience. Our conversation is also going to be followed by a Q&A period, so if you have any questions, please submit them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. It is now my profound pleasure to introduce you to our interviewer for this evening, Rachel Rose. Rachel is the author of 6 books, including The Octopus Has Three Hearts, which was a finalist for the Giller Prize, and Marion Byrne, a finalist for the Governor General's Literary Award. Rachel was the Poet Laureate of Vancouver from 2014 to 2017. With Anne-Marie Corrigan, she writes Desperate Writer, a journal on Substack. Tonight, Rachel will be interviewing Caroline Adderson, whose fabulous story collection, A Way to Be Happy, was longlisted for the Giller Prize last year. And with that, I'll hand things over now to Rachel and Caroline. Take it away, guys.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And thanks also to Emma for both of you for hosting for today. Hello to everyone and welcome to the Giller Book Club and a big warm welcome to Caroline Adderson. I want to start by telling you a little bit about what a marvel she is. Caroline Adderson is the author of 5 novels, 3 collections of short stories, as well as many books for young readers. Her work has received numerous award nominations, including the Sunday Times EFG Private Bank Short Story Award, the International Impact Dublin Literary Award, 2 Commonwealth Writers' Prizes, the Governor General's Literary Award, and the Rogers Trust Fiction Prize. She's been longlisted for the Giller Prize twice. Her awards also include 3 BC Book Prizes, 3 CBC Literary Awards, the Marion Engel Award for Mid-Career Achievement, and a National Magazine Award Gold Medal for Fiction. Phew! She teaches in the Writing and Publishing program at SFU, and these are but a selection among Caroline's many other awards and honors. A Way to Be Happy, the collection we'll be talking about today, has won praise in numerous reviews, including this endorsement from the New York Journal of Books, and I quote, "Caroline Adderson's stories are delicious. They zip and bubble, observe, and a number are touched with tenderness. Character, plot, voice, words, Adderson has command of all elements of a story. She should be read." Indeed, Caroline, you should be read and you will be read, if you haven't been already, by all those who are gathered here to take part in the Giller Book Club. So welcome again to our audience. I'm joining you from my basement right now, where I live and write on the beautiful traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And wherever in the world you're zooming in from, we're glad you're here. I always say when I'm interviewing writers that if there's a question that doesn't spark joy, we can just kind of move along to the next one. So Caroline, please feel under no obligation to answer any specific questions. I've got lots. I hope we can just have a real conversation as if we were sitting in a cafe somewhere, and we'll have time for questions from the audience at the end. So
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you.
you're so welcome. We can jump right in if you like.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about ways to be happy. I'd like to begin with that Chekhov quote that opens your book, and I'll just read that out. "Those who come 100 or 200 years after us will despise us for having lived such stupid and tasteless lives. Perhaps they'll find a way to be happy. As for us, there's only one hope for you and me, the hope that when we're asleep in our graves, visions might visit us, perhaps even pleasant ones." I read that quote and I thought, well, that's a nice positive attitude, isn't it? A lot of your characters are unfortunate, desperately sad people, or people intent on making life choices that seem to make them even more unhappy. The way to be happy escapes them, as it escapes so many of us. And yet, even in very unlikely circumstances, some of your characters find ways to belong and connect, which lead them to happiness, or at least closer to fine and away from the brink. How does this theme of ways to be happy or ways to be unhappy tie the stories together in your collection?
Well, to be honest, it tied it together after the fact.
I really
So, yeah, I put the story collection together, and this is my 3rd collection, and none of my collections have have I done the usual thing where I picked a story and took the title from that story in the collection and made the collection the title of the whole collection. Never seemed to work very well for me. So with this story, the title actually comes from the story Yolki Palki, which originally was called A Way to Be Happy, because that quote is embedded in the story. That story is about a Russian hitman having a crisis of conscience whilst on the job. So Chekhov came into that. And so I thought, oh, that would be an interesting title, because in a way, everybody is looking for happiness. I mean, we all are looking for happiness. So I thought it was all encompassing enough. But funnily enough, when I proposed it, my editor said, oh no, you can't call it that. It'll get shelved in the self-help section. And I said, yes, then they'll buy it and read it. And they'll say, yeah, I was miserable when I bought this book, but now I see I really wasn't, because these people are desperate, and actually my life is fine. So I felt it could fit in any category, literary or self-help. Yeah,
I
so it was
love that.
kind of an after the fact thing. Yeah, but everybody does, I think, in the way. I feel like, for me anyway, every story ends on an upbeat, even though there's plenty of downbeats within the stories.
Yeah. I also would love to see it misshelved in self-help.
Mhm,
I read a lot of self-help, and I think actually some fiction, although it doesn't tell us the way to be happy, also grapples with how to live a good life, and your collection
mhm,
definitely does do that.
mhm, mhm,
So as I read through it, I thought, well, your characters at first read seem to have nothing in common. They come from different eras. They include men and women, criminals and victims, the young and the old. And so I was curious, how do your characters come to you? And when they do, how do you know if you've got a keeper?
Well, I think characters is the most important aspect of fiction. That, what we're tracking when we write and when we read are those minute changes in the character through time, the moments where they change, sometimes just a tiny bit. If it's tiny, it might lead to a larger change, and that creates the character art. That's really the heart and what drives fiction. But interestingly, I actually come up with an idea first. It's usually kind of a plot idea, So, for example, if I just take the first story, all my old acquaintances are gone. So that came to me on a New Year's Eve. I left a party early because I really thought what I like to do on a New Year's Eve is be walking my dog at midnight. So I left early to do that. And I was walking around the block, and I came to a house, and the door was wide open. There was this rollicking party going on inside. And I thought, wow, if I didn't have the dog, I could probably just walk in there, join them. Nobody would even notice who I was. They wouldn't notice or that I hadn't been invited. And then I start thinking, well, who would do that? Why would you do that? And as I ponder that, sometimes for years, really, it just keeps niggling at me. Gradually, the people form, and the situation around that particular moment develops. Lots of things kind of glom together. It's almost like a snowball forming, and layers and layers and layers. And then in the act of writing, of course, everything completely changes. But it will always start with a surprising thing happen, I think, for me.
Yeah. A what if? What if I dropped
Oh,
a
yeah.
character in this situation? How would they
Yes.
get? Yeah, I love
Hmm.
that. Seems very familiar to me. I wonder if I could ask you to read a short excerpt from any
Sure.
story if
Sure.
you're to share with us.
Sure. Well, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned that you were going to ask me about the last story in the book. That's the longest story. Um, and it's historical, and it's set in what was called at that time the British Columbia Hospital for the Insane. And it's built on actual case histories of women, real women who were in the hospital. So a lot of the characters are composites of actual files that I read. So the two you're going to hear about are Margaret, and so she's 51, and she does pretty much a lot of maybe even most of the mending in the hospital because she's lame. And you don't find out till the very end why she's in the hospital. But all you need to know here is that she's a Swedenborgian, and a big part of a two-track story is the story of Lucy, who ends up there, and she's 15 years old. So it's the relationship between Margaret and Lucy that really drives the story.
Mm.
Margaret did not visit heaven in her dreams that night, for she didn't dream. She lay awake thinking about that other troubled girl, Lucy L., sturdy, freckled-spattered, coal scuttle for a mouth. Though expelled from a convent orphanage somewhere in the interior, she adamantly denied lack of kin. She'd seen her parents' wedding picture held for safekeeping, just as Lucy herself had been kept safe after her mother died birthing her. Her father, a blacksmith, moved on to look for work, but he was going to come back for her probably when she turned 18. Satan is that father's child, the day attendant at the time had told Matron Fillmore loud enough for all to hear. Lucy was put to work like everyone, first to the kitchen, where she spat in the food, then the laundry, where she punched Augusta for her silly talk. Uproar followed her. Sewing might keep her from the restraining chair. You have to sit still to sew, Matron told Margaret. How are you going to get her to do that? Margaret asked to try. And so Lucy stayed behind with Margaret after the room had been scrubbed and the others had left. Come close, Margaret told her. Careful, the floor's wet. Lucy lifted her skirts to her knees, took 2 running steps, and with a laugh, slid over to the window and plunked herself down on the end of Julia's bed. The lesson began. Didn't the nuns teach you needlework? Margaret soon had to ask, for even a simple running stitch daunted the girl, her seam as crooked as her mouth and peppered from finger pricks, each of which prompted a carillon of shrill screams. I stabbed an ass-faced boy I hated and didn't have to after that. Though often seized with the same compulsion, Margaret tutted. Lucy raised her eyebrows and leaned in. That was one of the nicer things I did. But I didn't know they'd bloody ship me here, did I? Where are they going to send me after this place? Margaret pointed out the window, toward the squat octagon behind the lawn house. See that tower? That's the isolation annex. Lucy slumped over her work. I'll be buggered if I'm stuck in this sinkhole for 3 years. Be nice and behave. It will keep you in good stead, and not just for now, through eternity too. What's that supposed to mean? She told Lucy then of the world on the other side, where angels lived just like them, in angel houses, in angel towns, and cities with streets and parks, almost the same as in our world, except everything was beautiful and good. They busied themselves all day doing God's work. What kind of work? Lucy asked, sucking a finger. What each is best at. Some raise children who have crossed over. Some help the ones just waking from death. Lucy perked up momentarily, perhaps thinking of her dead mother. But then she grumbled, work, work, work. Sounds like here. If it is, I'll be buggered if I'm going. Don't say that. Think what you're suited for. Vaudeville. This flummoxed Margaret. Vaudeville wasn't mentioned in the tract the new church woman on the streetcar gave her. Lucy, meanwhile, began an animated recounting of the time she'd escaped the convent and snuck into a show in town. The bag-punching sisters impressed her most. She leapt up and, fists swinging, galumphed about with a huge freckled grin, while Margaret laughed and laughed. That's what I want to do, or work at Woodward's dressed up all pretty. Do they have department stores? Again, Margaret hesitated. If you had everything you needed, what use would stores be? She seized on the dresses. On the other side, you wear garments according to your inner state. They might be different colors or the purest white. Lucy's brows, which were constantly dancing about on her face, giving away her every mood, grew still. Do you get to choose? I'd die for a yellow dress. You choose how to behave. Then maybe one day you'll be invited to join those inmost in heaven. They're dressed in radiant light because, like Adam and Eve in Eden, they're innocent. You mean they're naked? Guffaws from Lucy. She stuck out her apron front and shimmied her shoulders in an unchildlike way, mimicking the vaudeville shows she'd seen, or so Margaret hoped. Don't think of the body that way. Even here, your body clothes your spirit. That's what it's for. Lucy was still snickering, but after a moment, her face ironed out. Your heaven sounds a bloody lot nicer than what those fire and brimstone sisters said. Bunch of cows. Bugger them. What Lucy said next made Margaret quail. If I can't get out of here, maybe I'll go straight to that angel place.
Wow. Thank you so much. That's such a powerful, powerful story. And, I didn't know how much to talk about it without giving it away for people who haven't yet read it. But I thought, Margaret mending, she's also sort of mending her community in there and holding them together. And then Lucy is such an irrepressible, wild child. And then they create something quite remarkable at the end, which I won't say any more about. But I would like to ask, how did you research for that story? I think as I read it, that there was quite a bit of research. It really appeared to be.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I was originally starting to write a different story, and I just Googled insane asylums or mental institutions. This story is set in 1905, 1908. And so I put in, 19th century, I think. Anyway, what popped out were these 3 academic articles by a British Columbian academic that were about women in a particular period of time at the British Columbia Hospital for Insane. It was between 1905 and 1915 under the auspices of a particular, I almost want to say commandant, the overseer of the hospital at that time. And the stories in there were just amazing and so heartbreaking. I mean, it was basically a workhouse. There was no therapy. This was pre-medication. They had no treatment whatsoever. Basically, they just put everybody, you were referred there, you went there, you were sent there, committed against your will or because you wanted to go, and then you ran the place. So the women did everything, and the men too, on the men's side. And so I was just so captivated by these stories that I applied to go to the British Columbia archives and read these files myself. So you have to get court permission, because they're privacy issues. But because it's more than 100 years, I was able to get permission, and I went there and spent a week, just opened these boxes and boxes of files that were so heartbreaking, because they weren't just like medical reports. They were like letters from family. They were court transcripts. There were one point I opened up and there was a little piece of handmade lace that was in the envelope. You just want to
Odd.
weep, and then I learned pretty quickly, if I opened the file and on top there was a photograph of the woman, I knew she died in the institution, because that was always there right on the very top. And so Margaret's based on Lucy's story is absolutely true. That is Lucy's story. What happens in the story is true. The other characters are kind of composites of a number of women, but yeah, it's just really heartbreaking. And how they took, at that time, everything was this was, this very beginning of ideas of eugenics. So everything had to do with, it was hereditary. Insanity was hereditary. So if, for example, in the case of one of the characters in the story, say you've got postpartum depression, your husband is a brutal alcoholic, there's no food, your baby's screaming, so then you one night lose it and try to smother the screaming baby, none of those factors are considered. It's that all they were triggered to your inherent insanity. everything was in your genes, and this was the start of, we have to, actually euthanize people based on their genetics. Yeah, so it's pretty shocking.
It must have been. It must have been hard to spend only a week, and then I wonder
Yes,
if you're not still haunted by
I
the material
am.
that you worked with there. What
Yes,
an extraordinary experience.
yeah, it certainly was. Yeah,
Hmm. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I won't forget those characters anytime soon. And Lucy, I'm delighted to hear that she was real, that that was a real
yes,
interest for her and with her.
yeah.
Amazing. I have a question about another story, Obscure Objects. You
Hmm.
wrote about teaching at a private ESL college, work that both you and I have done, and work that one of your characters says is the quote, inexorable end to a degree in creative writing. That was funny because so true. I wanted to talk a little bit about your character Renata, who's a shapeshifter in that story. And
Hmm.
again, I don't want to give too much away for people who haven't yet read it, but it was just so quirky and weird, and it seemed it seemed to work so beautifully and smoothly within the story. Um, that I had to read it again to sort of look how you did that. How did you decide to tell the story that way, and why? Why did you use that strategy for her?
Well, it was very organic because I was actually grappling with material that had been given to me by a real person who asked that her identity be concealed. And so, as I struggled to think, well, how could I change it so nobody would guess that this is this particular person? I mean, not everything that Renata does is a true thing, but a number of the rather flamboyant and shocking things that Renata does were actually done by this person I know. And so as I began to try to think, how could I disguise her? I thought, well, maybe I'll make the act of disguising part of the story. So for those of you who haven't read it, she starts out and she's a, of an Italian heritage, and then she's Jewish, and then she's Chinese, and she has two daughters, and then she has two sons, and she just kind of goes back and forth through the whole thing, and it becomes this kind of metafictional story about writing this story in a particular way and how to get away with writing such a story. Yeah, it was fun.
I bet it was fun. It's super fun to read. And it's interesting because you said the other story said in the mental institution was a composite of characters that you researched and read about. And this is a composite, a meta composite, or a composite in a different
Hmm.
way. So all of these characters merge and shift, but there's something that stays true with her character, the through
Hmm.
line through. So
Hmm.
that's quite neat. I love that.
Hmm. Yeah, and there was metafictional things about myself too, where where some of those things really were true to me and some of them weren't, and you'll have to read it and try to guess what's what. Yeah.
I did. We will move on from there. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your preoccupations as a writer. You've written so many books. Are there certain themes that you keep returning to in your fiction? Um,
Yeah,
any,
I think
yeah,
one of the number one themes I see as I'm grappling with what I'm currently working on is the position of women in society, and despite having made incredible strides, um, how we're still you know not there by any means and going backwards, in fact. So that's very much a subject for me. um, but I'm also really interested in language, so a lot of my writing is centered around the language that I'm using, and so that can be like structurally, or it can be on a sentence level. So there's always that pulling me through. And I love to try different things. So I've written many different kinds of books. My last book was a novel, and it's a what I would call, I wouldn't call it a historical novel, though it's historically set. I would call it a biographical novel because it's about Chekhov's sister. So it's written to sound like a Chekhov. If Chekhov ever wrote a novel, it should sound, I thought it would sound like that. And all the things that happen in the story are true. Absolutely nothing is made up, except I switched some orders of things. And, I've written kind of slightly autobiographically, and the sky's falling. And so I'm always trying different things. I'm trying to do something now with breaking the narrative, shattering the narrative, where you have to read the whole thing to piece it together, like it's a broken doll, in fact. Yeah.
That segues very nicely into another question I had, because you write stories for children as well as short and long fiction. Do you see overlap between those genres? And
Well,
go ahead with that.
yeah,
And
yes. Well, the feeling is, one thing that writing for kids does for me is, like, I consider myself a tragic comic writer. Everything I write is really, like, completely dark, but really funny too. At
right,
least I hope it's funny.
yes, it is.
And with kids, you can just write really funny things. But I think there's something about, I don't know if it's just Canada, but if you wrote a really funny book, it was just really funny, nobody would take it seriously. And I think other countries with blacker senses of humor would understand that you can be deadly serious and really funny too. So I've always felt a little bit like my humor has held me back in terms of critical reception. But you don't have to worry about that when you're writing for kids. And on the other hand, writing for kids really reminded me about my duty to my protagonist to be active. So in writing for children, it's a genre, and there are certain rules, and you cannot break them. Unlike adult fiction, do anything you want. But one of the rules is that the child protagonist or the child protagonist substitute, the teddy bear or the doll or the squirrel, has to solve the problem on their own. That can't be solved by somebody else. And when I started writing for children, I realized how often I had those reflective protagonists who sat around and thought about things and were surrounded by really interesting people who did crazy things. And it kind of, around the time I wrote Ellen in Pieces, which is a novel in stories, she just kind of burst forth because of my writing for children as a real person who really F's up her own life and then fixes it herself.
Well, I hope that you never abandon your humor, because it's one of the things I most admire about your work. And I absolutely agree with you, but I don't think that's a flaw in your work. I think it's a flaw in maybe Canadian reception to a lot of work, and I wish it would change. But yes, thank you. That's very interesting about what you must do and what you're able to do in children's literature, and how it has shaped your work for writing for adults. Is there a genre you've never written in, but really admire and would like to try at some point?
Well, I can't. Well, I think the highest art is poetry, and I wouldn't dare. I just absolutely wouldn't dare. I have written like a picture book for children that's kind of like a poem, and when I write picture books, that's the way I'm kind of thinking of them, in terms of having some kind of rhythm and using really compressed language. But I, I mean, I wouldn't dare. I wouldn't dare.
I
Uh,
see poetry in the excerpt that you read, the rhythm of it, the language, the imagery of
mhm,
it there. Anyway, so
mhm.
I hope you dare. You.
Thank
Uh,
you.
Thank you too. Um, I wanted to say your stories are so just delightfully weird. The polite Canadian word might be quirky. I was looking again at Yoki Palki. You
Mhm.
mentioned that one before, and I thought maybe you might talk a little bit about that and how that idea came to you. where the origin of that story came, and you're
Sure.
in Russian writers maybe generally, or that part of the world, because I
Sorry, I
know.
didn't quite.
Oh, and your interest in Russian writers generally,
Yes, yes,
that part
yeah.
of the world.
Well, yeah, I have I just have this horrible crush on Chekhov, and I always have, and it's a tonal thing. It's like I love that that the stories he writes are so funny and so sad, and it's how I feel, and it's how I write, and so I go back again and again. And when I wrote A Russian Sister, the reason I did it was I thought then I'll be finished with him, and then look what happened. Look what happened. I
Right.
ended up, going back. But yeah, so Yolki Palki. Uh, the real inspiration for this story came from a fabulous book that I was asked to blurb by Judith McCormack called The Singing Forest. And it was about a young lawyer who's working on a war crimes trial, and she's supposed to uh, uh, deal with the extradition of a war criminal from Belarus who was involved in mass killings during the Stalinist era. And it was just an amazing book. And so I kind of had that in my mind when I was writing this, but that's set in the Stalinist era. But so what's the background to this story was that in my mind. So it's a modern story, and of course, all the things that are happening in the Soviet Union or Russia. Sorry, it's not much different than the Soviet Union, but Russia. Thinking about that, so I started reading a lot about Putin, and I'm reading about spies. I was very shocked to learn that particularly in this area, it said it doesn't really say where the city he's set, but he basically in the Pacific Northwest, that it's actually rife with Russian spies because they cluster around, they're sent around important technologies. Probably in Silicon Valley, it's the same thing, but it's the Boeing plant, according to these things that I had read, that they infiltrate and so I just saw that, and then I was reading a bunch of stuff on Putin, and it was around the time that they attempted to kill Navalny by putting that poison in his underpants, and it's just so you can't make that stuff up. So that's the situation where the guy is being sent to poison somebody, and then he's thinking, he's he has this kind of epiphany. He's having this problem with his lungs, and so I'm trying to peel it back. What happens in this story, the really kind of surprising thing that happens is I had no idea that was going to happen. I never actually know what's going to happen. I'm just following the person. Yes. He's getting on the plane, and different things I know mingle in. Like there's a place where he picks something up, and that was actually based on, I have a friend whose husband works as a technology like in protection, cyber terrorism and stuff. He's an anti-cyber, so he gets sent to these different places. And she was saying he went to this particular office in the States and he gets there, and it's like a dance studio for children, and he thinks he's at the wrong address, but it's in the back. It's like hidden. So I just got fascinated with all these spy type things, and then where this black, dark, terrible history of people in that area, from the czars all the way through Stalin and now. So yeah, just all kind of, and then this novel I read, and it's all kind of blending together, and I'm following this figure who's actually quite I felt so sad for him. He's like a victim of history. He's a victim of history. That's what he was, and a killer. So yeah, I think that's kind of our challenge as writers to love everybody regardless. We're kind of like God in a way, but on the page, I wish in real life I could be more loving like that, but on the page I can be very, very loving.
Well, he's such an unlovable character, and yet somehow you make us care, which is remarkable. And oh, I could talk quite a bit about Chekhov and about what you said and about how timely that story is, politically and globally, and also that you should watch The Americans if you haven't watched it.
Yes, I
Yeah.
have watched it, and there was it's not based on it, but there was an actual true story of a Canadian. They came as Canadians. The two children were born in Canada, and they didn't have any idea. Suddenly, they're after being tracked for more than a decade. They were arrested and extradited, and the children had been born in Canada and had no idea their parents were Russian spies. Yeah, it's
And
amazing.
yeah, I mean, it's just remarkable the stories that people live. For those who haven't seen it, The Americans is a show about Russian spies operating and hitmen operating in America covertly, and their family has no idea. So
Mhm.
yeah, thank you for that story, and for your explanation. And you can come over anytime and we can read Chekhov together because I'm a big fan. Um, so I wanted to ask how, okay, because it's been so beautiful today and the snowdrops and crocuses are out, and we live by the water and the mountains. And I'm wondering how living in this part of the world has shaped you as a writer.
Oh,
Do you
that's
read
an interesting.
Canadian or locally? I mean, you were just talking about Russia, but how does being here influence
Yeah.
your work? Maybe it
Yes.
does.
Yeah. Well, I certainly set a lot of my fiction here, and that's because I feel like I always have to know a place before I write about it. Um, so it certainly, on a very practical level, affects me. I have a very, I think we have a very kind and supportive literary community here in Vancouver. Um, and I think the fact that we're so far away from the center, in fact, has made me more productive. Whenever I go to Toronto and I see how many literary parties they have and how everybody has to continuously schmooze, yeah, I just feel so tired when I get home, and I realize that it's probably we just have a more laid back,
Mm.
quieter kind of life, and I think that affects our creativity. Do you think that too?
Um, Yeah, every now and then I wish I were in one of those big urban centers because I
Hmm.
think one feeds off the energy, but then you have to wear hard pants and you have to um,
Hmm.
really be involved in all of that drama too. So I think being a little bit on the outside is good for a writer,
Hmm.
as long as you're fortunate enough to partake when you can. So yeah.
Hmm.
And oh my gosh, we have just a few more minutes left before we'll open up for questions. So I have a couple left I'll try to get in. I'm in a book club that I just adore called Double Trouble. We read two books at a time, one fiction and one nonfiction, and they're selected because they have to relate to each other thematically.
Oh,
And it's
uh-huh.
super nerdy and super fun. And I also profile book clubs on my Substack, Desperate Writer, and I really love book club communities. And so I'm always thrilled to be part of the Giller Book Club. So if any audience members are in other book clubs, please reach out to me if you'd like to be featured. And Caroline, are you in a book club?
Oh, nobody wants me, Rachel.
Oh,
Nobody
are you
wants me.
kidding?
Oh, no, no, crapping all over their books. No. In fact, I teach a course at SFU, and I tell them, this course is going to get you kicked out of your book club, if anything. Yeah, no, I'm just so, I guess because most of the book clubs I've been invited to join, I haven't been really that interested in the books. I think
Uh,
yeah, I think I would be like to join. I think I'd like to join your book club, Rachel, maybe if
it's
you've
a
got
pretty
any
great one.
space.
What's interesting is there are only two other writers, and so I really have appreciated learning how readers look at books who are not
Hmm.
writers, and what appeals to them and why, and what makes them bored or depressed that they don't want to
Hmm.
continue. That's been a very useful
Hmm.
education. So if you were in a book club, would you have a particular genre or focus or um,
Well, one thing I'd really love a classics book club, because I feel like I'm always reading contemporary things, um, or I'm reading to support what I'm writing, and that and that I'd like to, it's not like I've never read the class. I have, but often it was a long time ago, and or there's great gaps. I've never read Moby Dick, and there's plenty I've never read Proust, and I would love to read those books, but I just feel like there's no time. And if I was in a club, then I'd feel too ashamed not to do the readings. And I would love it. I would love it. Yeah.
Yeah. And some of those books, it would be really good to have that support and be able to have the
Mhm.
conversations around them. Yeah, that sounds like such a worthy endeavor. I'd love that too. And I'd also love a book club of banned books that are banned on the right
Mhm.
and on the left, and just kind of alternate and get into them. That would be fun.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
are you
Mhm.
reading any books that are just terrific right now that you wish everybody in the Giller Book Club would go out and read?
Well, funny you ask.
Funny, isn't it? Oh my gosh.
Yes. Here's Rachel Rose. The Octopus Has Three Hearts. So when I found out Rachel was going to interview me here, I thought, oh, and I still haven't read that book. And so I went out and got it. And this is fantastic. This collection is fantastic. So any of you, if you read my book and you liked it, this is like that thing they do in the CBC. If you like this, you'll like this. You will really like it. There's so much overlapping. Firstly, the stories are completely varied. They're utterly surprising. They're so darkly funny. Some of them even, have thematically, they're very similar. It's just a knockout collection.
Isn't it? That
Yes,
they talk to each other. It is
yes,
great.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, it was really, this has been a really good pairing, the two of us. And the other one is another Giller nominated book, which is Curiosities by Anne Fleming. I just finished reading this, and I don't know how she wrote such a delightful book about such a horrible subject. It's about the witch trials in England in the 1600s, but it's the language. She uses the language of the time. She uses the vocabulary of the time. So like I rarely have to look a word up when I'm reading a book, but this one I have a big long list of words I had to look up because we don't use these words anymore, and it was just a delight. The book is delightful and subversive, and it was just wonderful. Yeah.
She's so terrific. Yeah, that's on my list of books to read. And she's also a writer, a Canadian writer who's also funny. I think
Mm-hmm.
her subjects are very serious often. She
Yes.
humor to them, which we both appreciate. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
thank you. Well, I'm going to share a couple that I'm reading too, just quickly. This one is called The Ministry of Time, and I haven't finished it, but it's just so quirky and so weird. It's by Kellyanne Bradley. People from the past are brought to the present, including an Arctic explorer from the doomed Franklin expedition,
Mm-hmm.
and romance and chaos and murder ensue. And then here's another one. So I guess again, with my book club has changed the way I think about books, but this one is a nonfiction called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And it was written in 2012, but it could not be more timely now as we're
Mm-hmm.
watching. I don't even need to say what we're watching as we're watching everything unfurl, and our country and other countries are being divided and sorted. I highly recommend this book.
Mm-hmm.
I recommend that people in book clubs read it together so you can talk about it and try to
Mm-hmm.
resist this kind of division that we're facing. Oh my goodness. I could talk and talk, but I think I'd like to take a look at the questions that we may have. And I have so many more myself. Let's see, let me take a quick peek. I may be able to ask some more of mine too. Oh, okay. We have no questions typed in yet, so audience, feel free, and that means I get to keep talking. Um, what a delight.
We've
Um,
stunned them, Rachel. We've stunned them.
we've said everything there is to say. Um, so tell me a little bit about your own writing community here and who your first readers are and
Mm-hmm.
who sustains you as a writer to keep doing that
Mm-hmm.
hard work of sitting down day after day.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm very fortunate in that. So probably my first writer is Shana Lambert, who's a brilliant writer. Her last book was Petra, came out in 2020 novel. She's a brilliant short story writer too. And so we have a little arrangement where if we're doing stories, if I finish a story, I send it to her, and then we go out to discuss it to the bar, and I buy the drinks. But if we're writing novels, we have to buy dinner and drinks for the person who's doing the
Cheap date,
critiquing.
for the novel.
Yeah, we have to. You really have to pay for it. So she's my first one, and then I also my friend Paul Hedrick is a brilliant, very astute critic. Kathy Page and I share work to other people. I just very lucky that I just got to read Joan Thomas's memoir that she's been working on. So so it's really exciting because not only do I get astute feedback, but I also get previews of wonderful books that are soon to be coming to the reading public. It's very rewarding.
Yeah, it's quite a gift, isn't it, to have that kind of exchange, and the tenderness that comes, as well as the knowing that somebody's going to tell you what they see are the flaws of your manuscript, that you trust them with that. Yeah.
And it's so helpful to have another writer do that, before it goes to the editor who may not be a writer, because the writer can give feedback from the inside. You've probably had grappled with the same problem yourself, and this is how you solved it. You can recommend particular books and things, and it's a different way of looking at a draft of something than you would get from an editor at the publishing house. At least that's been my experience. And then of course you get all that commiseration which you get not to get from your editor at your publishing house.
Have you worked with many different editors, or are you with one particular house generally?
In my children's, tons of different editors. In my adult, not very many. John Metcalf, and basically John Metcalf was my first editor and edited this book of stories too. And Patrick Crean, I was with him for years. Followed him around to the different places he worked, lastly at HarperCollins, and he recently retired.
Yeah, two great editors. Yes, I think it's good to have the writing community to start with, though, or the specific people, not community, but specific people with whom you have a long relationship, and dinner and drinks and all of the rest. Yeah. So do you have an ideal reader in your mind when you write? Who are you writing for? Who are you writing this collection for? Not that there's a didactic purpose necessary.
Yes. No, there certainly isn't. I'm writing for the character. So I have in my mind that this is a person, even though the person is imaginary, but it is my job as a writer to accurately portray what happened to this person, the changes that how they became who they are at the end of the story. And that is my job, to understand the thoughts, feelings, motivations of the character. And I don't think a lot about the reader, and I think I would be a more successful reader if I did. Do people actually want to read about these disagreeable characters? I rarely ask myself that, because I want to read about them, and I feel like that's my main responsibility.
I love that answer. I've never heard that answer before. So your fidelity is to the character. I'm glad this is being recorded, because I'm going to go back and listen to that. You're writing for the character, as if you're trying to take their part, or fully psychologically understand them, or advocate for them, almost, even if they are despicable.
Like a biographer. I'm the biographer, but the fact you know their thoughts and make them speak is, of course, again, we get back to God. I am their God, and I am creating them, and I have to bring them in the round as best as I possibly can, and hope that you will come to love them too, despite all their flaws. That's how I approach it.
Wow, I'm going to think about that for a while. That's so good and refreshing and different than anything I've heard. So your fidelity is to your character because you are the creator.
Mhm.
Um, what are you hoping? Okay, so this might be something that is not a priority for you, but I will ask it anyway. What do you hope that readers will take away from this collection when they've read your characters from different walks of life and who are living all of these challenging lives? What do you hope they'll take away?
Well, I hope that it might in some small way enlarge the circle of compassion that the reader feels. You know, that when we encounter people in our own lives that are difficult or that we want to turn away from, that the experience of being able to get inside the head of a person like that might make us kinder and more compassionate, empathetic. Yeah.
Yes. From your mouth to God's ears, as they say. We have some questions now. So let me just take a quick peek here. Um, so here's one. How has your writing discipline changed over the years? And do you have a nugget of wisdom to pass on to other writers, maybe emerging writers, or um, what advice do you have for other writers out there?
Well, I think it's very important to, especially if you start writing to, if you're just a new writer, is to develop a practice that, and that's really helpful if you can do it consistently. And that's the same time and place every day if possible. So what you're trying to do is create a body memory. So when people say, "Oh, how are you so disciplined?" Like it's just not even an issue. You just go upstairs and do it. That you're on autopilot in a way, and so it takes some discipline to get to that plane, and to make it easier would be to have that practice. And I think it's really important to save your writing time. That's your best mental time. So like for me, it's the morning. I couldn't really, I mean, when I had a little baby, I could write at any time, you know, but when my kid's grown up now, so I'm back to, I have to write in the morning because that's when I'm most alert. And that's when my language palette is clear and fresh. And I don't write as much as I used to. Like I used to spend a lot more time, and I used to say no. Like if someone would say, "Let's have lunch tomorrow." No, it's Thursday. I can't have lunch with you. And partly that was because people I felt didn't respect the fact that I was actually doing a job just because I didn't earn very much money off of it, or I could set my own hours. But also it was part of being rigorously disciplined. But now that's what's changed. Is now I feel like I've published a lot of books. Um, do I, I'm not so driven. I, I, I don't know how long the world's going to go on. I'd like to go to lunch, actually. I can write tomorrow. Yeah, I'm a bit
Ah,
loosey about that.
yes.
But to start with, you should be rigorous. You should be rigorous until you have a body memory, a body discipline that takes you butt in chair, all that stuff. Yeah.
So it seems that you were able to write for extended periods then for many hours each day.
Well, I would never have written more than so than 3 or 4 in terms of composing, but then there's all the other things you have to
All
do
the
that I would do later, you know.
Yes.
And if I'm rewriting, then it's quite I can it's not quite composition is very difficult, and I don't think anybody can really sustain the kind of deep focus that you need to write a first draft of something any longer than 3 hours, and that's with tea breaks, frequent
Yes.
tea breaks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. We've got more questions here. I'll try to get to as many as I can in our little bit of time left. Oh my goodness, such great questions, people. Um, So somebody here says, Caroline, did you know poetry is being posted on Toronto Transit?
Mhm.
Your short story about the man who reads poetry on the bus as his life is falling apart. This person just highlighted that and said what an amazing
Mhm.
writer you are. So
Oh,
I
that's nice. That's from my second collection, a story called Falling, and I actually came up with that story taking the bus to work when I was teaching downtown and thinking and looking at all the business types and thinking, oh, there's the poem. I wonder what they think when they read that. Do they even know it's a poem? So that's how I actually wrote that story. Yeah.
thank you. Here's a question that asks how long you turn your story ideas over in your mind before you actually start writing them, and how do you keep track of and organize and return to your ideas? So that's two questions,
Yes. Yeah.
but both are useful for people who are writing.
Hmm. Well, I think the important thing to know is that writing, the part of writing that's where you're sitting down and actually writing, is a tiny fraction of it. That there's so much is going on the unconscious level, and so I can think about, I'll keep tossing ideas around for years sometimes till, so for this book, I decided I'm going to write a book of stories. And so I had been thinking about these story ideas for years. It had been I published my last book of stories in 2010. So that's like 14 years later. So I could have been thinking about some of those stories for 14 years before I actually wrote them. And then I have a drafting method for stories where I write a draft, I put it away, I write another draft, I put it away, I write another draft, put it away. And I usually do go till I have four first drafts, and then I start cycling through again, and then I'll add another draft in until I have a book, and that would take me about 2 years. But the part of putting all the ideas together and coming up with the story itself, that could go on for a long, long time.
So when you write a draft and put it away, then you're working on another story.
Yes, yes. And so when I finally go back to it, it's like I never wrote it.
Right.
And,
Yes.
it's not uncommon for me to be reading something I wrote myself and say, what is she talking about? What is this even supposed to mean? Yes, especially as I get older. But what's great about it is that you can, it's not your treasure anymore. You're
Right.
open to changing it. You're open to moving things around. And instead of like I can't change a word, it's utter brilliance. I never feel that way. I'm very ready to change all the words.
Yes, I think that that process is very useful, that detachment and detaching, reattaching, and looking at it with new eyes, fresh eyes. Yeah. Well, let's try and get to maybe two. We'll do one for sure. This person writes, she wants to know what books are on your bookshelf and do you organize them by author?
Oh,
So we know it's a huge
that
question. I'm sure you have so many, and I know
yes,
there's a check off there. How do you organize them? And maybe actually I can
yes,
tie this in with another question below it. Um, uh, this other person says your storytelling reminds me of Elizabeth Strout and the world of Olive Kittredge. Do you enjoy her
yes.
work? Is she on your bookshelf? Would you say she's an influence?
She is on my bookshelf, Olive Kitteridge. I've read that. That's the only book of hers I've read, though. And I did really love that book. And it was one of my models for Ellen in Pieces, where I was trying to do a similar thing. So all these books here and over on the other side of the door there are all my Canadian books. And almost all of them are signed to me. And then I have my international books. They're all alphabetical, by the way. At the top here is poetry and nonfiction, much smaller. And then over on this side, there's children's books. And yeah, so I also am a huge library user, but I tend to buy Canadian books, and if I go to reading, I buy the book because I want to be a good colleague and support the writer. Um, but I can't possibly purchase everything I
Right.
read. So if you're alive and you're Canadian, I'm going to buy your book.
I love
If
that.
you're dead, I might get it from the library.
That sounds fair and kind and wonderfully supportive. And I know that we're not ready to stop talking, but we are out of time. So, Caroline, congratulations on your tremendous success. And thank you so much for this excellent conversation. And thank you, audience, as well, for your wonderful
Thank
engagement
you.
and questions. Happy Giller Book Club, everyone. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much.
Bye.
And Jacob. Yeah, this was a
Thank you.
pleasure.
It was really
yeah,
fun.
I second that all for sure. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Caroline. That was an awesome conversation. I really enjoyed that. I really hope everybody in the audience enjoyed that as much as I did. I just have a few quick reminders for everybody before we log off for the night. If you know anybody who couldn't make it this evening, please let them know that this interview is going to be available on our YouTube channel tomorrow. Please also join us for our next Giller Book Club in about 2 weeks' time on Tuesday, March 18th. We're going to hear from writer Karma Brown, who's going to interview Shashi Bahad about Shashi's long-listed story collection, Death by a Thousand Cuts. If you've
Great
already
collection.
Very good collection. I agree. If you've already joined our mailing list, then you're going to get sent a registration link for that right into your inbox. But if you haven't done that yet, then please make sure to head over to gillerprize.ca and you can sign up. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.